I've often been seen as a skeptic of Bitcoin by a lot of my followers. But on this video, I'm going to tell you the one thing I really like about Bitcoin. So stay tuned to find out what that is. Now, many of my followers have commented about the fact that I seem skeptical about Bitcoin and other coins and so on. And my general view hasn't necessarily changed. I do think it's a speculative asset. And indeed, many people who are very bullish on Bitcoin and other coins have said the same thing, that basically you should be willing to see it go down to zero. I can remember I was listening to an interview a few weeks ago with one of the leading providers of Bitcoin. I think he owns one of the exchanges, and he says that if you buy it, you should be willing to see it go down to zero as much as it go to 1 million, because it is speculative. And I agree with that because it's only based on supply and demand, it's not based on, say, a yield or a coupon or whatever, then it is speculative by definition compared to buying an asset that can be more easily valued in many ways. However, there is one thing I do like about the whole Bitcoin story, and that's this, that basically Bitcoin is largely deregulated. Now, it's changed over the years. It started out almost completely deregulated, but now more and more regulations are coming in. But say if this happened 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and many kind of so-called serious men in suits just said, oh, it's unregulated, that would have just been the end of the story, right? But a lot of people, including younger people, and indeed even some wealthier people, they didn't give a damn about the fact that a lot of financial professionals or pundits were saying, oh, this is unregulated, it could go down to zero. They were sensible enough to know, most of them, I know there are some people with their heads in the clouds, but they were sensible enough to know, yes, this is a deregulated asset, or largely unregulated asset. Yes, it could go to zero, but guess what? I'm just going to put 1% of my portfolio in this, or 2% of my portfolio, or maybe a higher percent of my portfolio, but I'm young and I don't have, that much money in the case of some 18, 19-year-olds. So most people had common sense about this, and they weren't scared about the fact that people said, oh, it's unregulated. So some of the best arguments against Bitcoin have came from the likes of Buffett, Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, before he died, but they didn't focus on the regulation aspect. But one thing I found quite annoying is how a lot of people in finance would just say, oh, it's deregulated or it's unregulated, like that should be the end of the matter, right? Just because something's unregulated and deregulated doesn't mean it's a bad investment. I mean, let's face it, some of the wealthiest people in the world, what do they do once they get a lot of money? They tend to go into private unregulated investments like Dragon's Den style private equity investments, which are less regulated than most investments. And some people might say, oh yes, but if you're wealthy and you're older or whatever, you don't need so much so-called protection from the regulator because you already have enough money anyway. It doesn't really matter if you lose some money. But I get back to a central point. People should be able to do whatever they want to do with their own money. I can remember on LinkedIn 1 or 2 months ago, I put something on there, which was, I actually quoted directly a regulator from the SEC. And I said, oh, this is one of the few times ever I've completely 100% agreed with a regulator. And basically what she said was, and I quoted from her verbatim, I'm not getting my words out here, but basically what she said is, why should I as a regulator tell fellow Americans what they should and shouldn't buy? As long as they go in with their eyes wide open, why should it only be the wealthiest people who can go into certain investments? As long as people know what they're getting into, it doesn't matter if they put in 1% of their wealth or 100% of their wealth into something, provided they're going in with their eyes wide open. Why shouldn't they be able to go in? And of course, what she was saying was absolutely right, that, if you've got people lying, let's say you've got somebody who's selling a fake coin or something like that, of course, that should be illegal, and it already is, right? That comes under criminal law. But if you've got a bunch of people who are willing to take a risk with their own money and they know what they're getting themselves into, that's absolutely fine. It's very patronizing to say only wealthy people can measure risk. I don't think the vast majority of the public are stupid when it comes to this. Yes, people can engage in stupid decisions, and even stock markets, which aren't as volatile as something like crypto, you have these huge periods of irrational exuberance, as George Soros says. Then you have the crashes, and even though the general trend is good with stocks, you do have these irrational moves. But in general, I think the public has a lot more common sense than most politicians and regulators think. That doesn't mean they're always like that. There can be extremes in emotion, fear, greed, egoism and whatever. But I think a lot of people have got a lot more common sense than people out there think in the financial sector, amongst the regulators in particular and governments in particular. So the fact that a lot of these young millennials, teenagers, sometimes people in their 20s or even people who are older, have stuck with this despite the fact that it's been hammered by so many people saying it's unregulated, it's not safe. I think that's good in many ways, because I think it will start to affect how people see other investments as well. So even when it comes to private investments, private placements, I don't think this idea of, oh, it's unregulated, it's just going to close the argument down when it comes to a lot of the people who are, coming up the ranks now. And I think that's only going to get bigger, because what we're seeing around the world is we're seeing people are becoming more skeptical about what I would call traditional authority. That could be, government, it could be the education system, it could be the regulators or whatever. But if you think back to the 1950s, not that I was around in the 1950s, but you know what I mean. If you look on YouTube and the videos and whatever, people had a lot of trust in traditional authorities, and gradually over time, especially the last 20 years with the internet and whatever, I think people are caring about more deregulated authority. So what's the first thing you do when you look for a product these days? You probably look on the online reviews. If the online reviews are good, you probably don't give a damn what the average regulator or government or, I don't know, your friend who's an accountant says, or a lawyer or whatever. You're more interested probably in the general view of the market, right? That if the general view is positive, then maybe you should at least dip your toes in. And I mean, I can remember, 16, 17, 18 years ago, when eBay was getting big, a lot of, again, the serious men in suits, you could put in inverted commas, said, oh, it's unregulated. Why should we all rely on online reviews? It's never going to take over the shops, the brick and mortar and whatever. But the average person had more common sense than that. So I think this is part of a bigger trend. So don't get me wrong, I'm not justifying Bitcoin on this video. I'm not saying it's good, it's bad or whatever. And full disclosure, I personally don't own any Bitcoin. I'm not saying it's going to go up, I'm not saying it's going to go down, I'm not saying it's going to go sideways, but the only good thing I do see in this story is I do like the fact a lot of people ignored the so-called advice that, oh, it's unregulated, so therefore you shouldn't buy it. How can I help you? In two ways. First of all, are you an expat, a high net wealth individual, or just somebody who lives in a part of the world where it's difficult to get access to quality investment solutions? In which case, go onto my website on adamfayed.com and find out more. If you don't fit into any of those categories, then in which case there's a range of free material on my website, on this YouTube channel, and indeed on my Quora, where I get over 200 or have received over 231 million views in the last few years. And finally, if you want to actually read my thoughts in more detail, go onto Amazon and find my book on there.